They said the thing in the woods wasn't human anymore. For 17 years, the children of Millbrook grew up hearing whispers about the creature that lived beyond the pine fence, the one that moved only at night, the one whose cries sounded almost like words but never quite made sense. Parents locked their doors at sunset. Hunters who ventured too deep into the forest came back with stories of shadows that followed them, of eyes that reflected moonlight like broken glass, of something that watched from the darkness but never showed its face. The town had learned to live with fear as their closest neighbor, had learned to pretend that the monster in the woods was just a story, just superstition, just the wind playing tricks through the trees. But on a frostbitten morning in November, when old Thomas Creek stumbled out of the forest with tears streaming down his weathered face, what he found in that clearing would force them to confront a truth more horrifying than any monster, that sometimes the real monsters are the ones who look just like us. The town of Millbrook sat in a valley between two mountain ridges like a secret tucked into the earth's pocket. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the same families had lived for generations, where the bakery still opened at 5 in the morning and the church bells rang every Sunday without fail. The main street stretched for exactly 8 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had stood since before the war, their windows displaying the same goods year after year. There was Paulson's General Store, Miller's Hardware, the post office with its fading American flag, and Betty's Diner, where the coffee was always hot and the gossip was always hotter. But for all its small-town charm, Millbrook carried a shadow that never quite lifted. It hung over the eastern edge of town where the forest began, thick and dark and seemingly endless. The locals called it the Deep Wood, and they spoke of it the way people speak of graves, with respect and unease. Children were taught from the time they could walk that the Deep Wood was forbidden territory. No playing near the tree line, no wandering off the marked paths, no going into the forest after dark, ever. The warnings were always the same, passed down from parent to child like an inheritance of fear. There were dangerous animals in those woods, they said. The terrain was treacherous. People had gotten lost and never found their way back. But beneath the practical explanations, there was always something else, something unspoken that lived in the pauses between words and the way adults' eyes would dart toward the tree line when they thought no one was watching. Thomas Creek had been Millbrook's best hunter for 43 years. He knew the mountains like most men knew their own homes, could track a deer through snow or read weather patterns in the way birds flew. His cabin sat on the northern edge of town, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough that he could step out his back door and be in wilderness within minutes. He was a quiet man, tall and lean, with hands that were all calluses and scars from a lifetime of outdoor work. People respected Thomas. When he spoke, which wasn't often, people listened. He lived alone, had done so since his wife Margaret passed away 9 years ago. They had never had children, which some people said was a blessing and others said was a curse. But Thomas never talked about it either way. He kept to himself, sold venison and wild turkey to the local restaurants, and spent his days in the woods where the silence suited him better than conversation ever had. On the morning of November 14th, Thomas woke before dawn, as he always did. The frost had come early that year, coating everything in a thin layer of white that crunched under his boots as he made his way to the shed. He loaded his rifle, checked his supplies, and headed into the forest just as the first grey light began to creep over the mountains. He was tracking a buck he had spotted 3 days earlier, a massive 8-pointer that would feed him through most of the winter. The trail led him deeper into the deep wood than he usually went. Thomas wasn't superstitious like the townspeople. He had been hunting these woods since he was a boy and had never seen anything more frightening than a black bear or a cougar. The stories people told, the warnings they whispered, he had always dismissed them as small-town nonsense, the kind of folklore that grew in places where people had too little to do and too much time to imagine. But as he pushed further east, following the buck's tracks through increasingly dense underbrush, something began to feel wrong. The forest had gone too quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the leaves, just his own breathing and the crunch of frost beneath his feet. Thomas had hunted long enough to know that silence in the woods meant something was off. Predator nearby, maybe, or a storm coming in. Something that made the wildlife take cover. He found the buck an hour later, or what was left of it. The animal had been torn apart, its body scattered across a small clearing in a way that made Thomas's stomach turn. This wasn't the work of wolves or bears. The violence was too extreme, too chaotic. Pieces of the deer hung from low branches, and the ground was dark with blood that had already started to freeze. Thomas had seen his share of nature's brutality, but this was something else. This looked almost deliberate, like rage had been given physical form. He was about to turn back, to leave this cursed clearing and forget he had ever seen it, when he heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the whisper of wind through pine needles. A whimper. No, not quite a whimper. Something between a cry and a moan, pitched low and wavering like whoever was making it had forgotten how to form proper sounds. Thomas froze, his rifle coming up instinctively to his shoulder. The sound came again, from somewhere beyond a thick stand of evergreens on the far side of the clearing. Every instinct he had told him to leave, to run back to town and forget this place existed. But Thomas Creek was not a man who ran from things. He had spent 4 decades in these woods, had faced down charging bears and cornered mountain lions. Whatever was making that sound, you would face it head on. He moved slowly, carefully, keeping his rifle ready. The evergreens formed a natural barrier, their branches so thick and low that he had to push through them sideways. On the other side, he found himself in a smaller clearing, this one ringed by old oaks whose branches twisted overhead like arthritic fingers. And there, at the base of the largest oak, was a structure that made Thomas stop dead in his tracks. It was a shelter of sorts, though calling it that was generous. Someone had lashed together branches and pine boughs to form a crude lean-to against the trunk of the tree. Old blankets, rotted and filthy, were piled in the opening. Scattered around the shelter were bones, animal bones mostly, picked clean and white. There were other things too, objects that looked like they had been collected over years. A rusted coffee can, scraps of cloth tied to branches, a child's shoe, so small and worn that Thomas felt his chest tighten at the sight of it. The sound came again, from inside the shelter. Thomas could see movement now, something shifting beneath the blankets. His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. For a moment, every story he had ever dismissed, every warning he had laughed off, came rushing back. Maybe the townspeople had been right. Maybe there was something in these woods that shouldn't exist. "Come out," Thomas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Come out slow, and keep your hands where I can see them." For several long seconds there was only silence. Then, slowly, the blanket shifted aside, and something emerged from the shelter. Thomas's first instinct was to shoot. His finger actually began to squeeze the trigger before his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. It was a person, not a bear, not a wolf, not whatever monster his imagination had conjured. A person, but one so filthy, so covered in grime and matted hair and tattered cloth that they barely looked human. They were wrapped in burlap sacks that had been tied together with twine, the rough fabric hanging off a frame that was nothing but skin and bones. The hair was long and tangled, so thick with dirt and leaves that Thomas couldn't tell what color it had once been. The face, what little he could see of it beneath the grime, was turned down toward the ground, and the smell, God, the smell that hit him, was like death and rot and things left to decay in dark places. "Please," the person said, and Thomas realized with a shock that it was a woman's voice, thin and cracked from disuse but unmistakably female. "Please, don't hurt me." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly, his mind racing. A woman, out here, living like an animal in a shelter made of sticks and garbage. How long had she been here? Days? Weeks? "I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas said, keeping his voice calm the way he would with a frightened animal. "Are you injured? Are you lost?" She had wrapped her arms around herself, and Thomas could see she was shaking, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "Please don't make me go back," she whispered. "I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." "Just don't make me go back." "Back where?" Thomas took a step closer, then stopped when the woman flinched away. "Where did you come from?" But the woman just shook her head, rocking slightly back and forth, mumbling words Thomas couldn't quite make out. He could see now that her feet were bare, black with dirt and covered in cuts and scars. Her hands, clutching at the burlap wrapped around her, were in the same condition. This woman had been out here for a long time. Not days or weeks. Months. Maybe longer. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. A growing horror that had nothing to do with monsters or creatures from stories. This was real. This was a human being who had been living like an animal in the woods, so close to town that on a quiet night you could probably hear the church bells from here. "I'm going to help you," Thomas said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder to show he meant no harm. "My name is Thomas. I live in town. Not far from here. I can get you somewhere warm, get you food and clean clothes, but I need you to come with me. Can you do that?" The woman looked up for the first time, and Thomas had to force himself not to react to what he saw. Her face was so thin that her skull showed through, her eyes sunken deep into dark hollows. But it was her expression that got to him, the raw terror mixed with something that looked almost like hope, as if she wanted to believe him but had forgotten how. "You won't tell them about me?" she asked. "You won't let them know where I am?" "Who's them?" Thomas asked. "Who are you hiding from?" The woman's eyes darted to the trees as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "The town," she whispered. "All of them. They said I was a monster. They said I had to stay away." Thomas felt his jaw clench. "You're not a monster. You're a person. And you're hurt and sick and you need help. I don't know who told you those things, but they were wrong." He reached out slowly, the way you would to a feral cat, offering his hand. The woman stared at it for a long moment, her entire body trembling. Then, so slowly that Thomas could count each individual movement, she reached out and placed her filthy hand in his. Her skin was ice cold, and Thomas could feel every bone in her fingers like she was made of nothing but skeleton wrapped in paper. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you home." It took nearly 3 hours to get back to town. The woman could barely walk, her legs weak and unsteady from malnutrition and exposure. Thomas had to half-carry her most of the way, and several times she collapsed entirely and he had to stop and let her rest. She wouldn't let him look at her face, kept turning away and hiding behind her hair whenever he tried to see her properly. And the whole time she kept whispering the same words over and over. "Monster. Monster. That's what they called me. Monster." By the time they reached the edge of town, Thomas had made a decision. He didn't know what had happened to this woman, didn't know why she had been living in the woods like something less than human. But he knew that walking her down Main Street in broad daylight, filthy and wrapped in burlap and barely able to stand, would cause a panic. People would stare. They would whisper. They would make everything worse. So he took her to his cabin through the back way, avoiding the main roads. He got her inside and sat her down in front of the fireplace, wrapping her in clean blankets while he heated water for a bath. She sat there shivering and silent, staring at the flames like she had never seen fire before. Thomas tried calling the sheriff, but the line was busy. He tried the doctor's office, but no one answered. It was Sunday morning, he realized. Everyone would be at church. He decided to clean her up first, make her presentable, and then figure out what to do next. She was in no condition to go anywhere anyway. She needed food and warmth and medical attention, and she needed it now. He helped her to the bathroom, running a warm bath and leaving her with soap and clean towels. "Take your time," he told her. "I'll find you some clothes." He was in the bedroom, pulling out an old flannel shirt and some sweatpants that would be too big but at least clean. When he heard her scream, it was a sound of pure terror, and Thomas ran back to the bathroom thinking she had fallen or hurt herself. But when he pushed open the door, she was standing in front of the mirror, the burlap and filthy clothes stripped away, staring at her reflection with a look of absolute horror on her face. And for the first time, Thomas saw her clearly, saw the scars that covered her body like a roadmap of pain, saw the burns on her arms and legs that had healed badly, leaving twisted skin behind, saw the marks around her wrists and ankles where something had bound her so tightly and for so long that the scars had become permanent. But most of all, he saw her face. The right side was normal, or would have been if not for the emaciation and grime. But the left side was different. A large birthmark, dark purple and raised, covered most of her cheek and extended down her neck. It was the kind of mark that some people were born with, harmless but noticeable, the kind of thing that in another time might have been called a port wine stain. The woman touched her face with shaking fingers, tracing the birthmark as tears began to stream down her cheeks. "Monster," she whispered. They were right. "I'm a monster." Thomas felt something break inside his chest. He stepped forward and took her gently by the shoulders, turning her away from the mirror. "You listen to me," he said firmly. "You are not a monster. Do you hear me? Whatever happened to you, whoever told you that, they were wrong. You're a human being, and you deserve to be treated like one." But the woman just shook her head, sobbing now, her whole body racked with the force of her crying, and Thomas held her, This broken stranger who he had found living like an animal in the woods, and wondered what kind of evil could do this to another person. Wondered what kind of town he had been living in all these years. What secrets had been hiding just beyond the tree line while everyone went about their normal lives pretending everything was fine. He got her cleaned up and dressed, fed her soup and bread which she ate like someone who had forgotten what real food tasted like. Then he wrapped her in blankets on the couch and told her to rest while he went to get help. But before he left, he asked her one question. "What's your name?" The woman looked at him with eyes that held decades of pain. "Sarah," she whispered. "My name is Sarah." Thomas nodded. "Well, Sarah, I'm going to make sure you're safe now. I promise you that." He left her sleeping by the fire and walked into town, his mind churning with questions and a growing anger that made his hands shake. The church service had just ended, and people were spilling out onto the street, laughing and talking about the sermon and making plans for Sunday dinner. Thomas walked straight to Sheriff Davies, who was standing on the church steps talking to Mayor Coleman. "I need to speak with you," Thomas said. "Both of you, now." Something in his voice made them both stop mid-sentence. Sheriff Davies was a big man, 55 and running to fat, but still sharp-eyed and observant. "What's wrong, Thomas? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Thomas said quietly. "A woman. I found her in the deep wood, living in a shelter made of sticks, barely alive. She's at my cabin now, and she needs a doctor. But before I get Doc Harrison, I need to know something. I need to know if either of you know anything about a woman named Sarah who's been living in those woods." The effect of his words was immediate and striking. Both men went pale, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something that looked like fear. Sheriff Davies glanced at Mayor Coleman, and in that single look, Thomas saw confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. They knew. They knew about Sarah. "Now, Thomas," Mayor Coleman started, his voice taking on a placating tone. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Thomas interrupted. "I found a woman half dead in the woods. She's covered in scars, starved nearly to death, and she's been living out there for God knows how long. And when she saw herself in the mirror, she called herself a monster. So I'm going to ask you again, and I want the truth this time. Do you know about Sarah?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to drown in. People had started to notice the confrontation, a crowd gathering on the church steps to watch. Thomas could see recognition dawning on some faces, fear on others, and slowly, like a wound being reopened, the truth began to emerge. "We thought she was dead," Sheriff Davies said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help us, we all thought she was dead." The crowd on the church steps had grown larger, faces that Thomas had known his entire life now staring at him with expressions ranging from shame to anger to something that looked like panic. Sheriff Davies cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the gathering townspeople before motioning toward the street. "Maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private." "No," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying across the square. "I think everyone here needs to hear this. A woman has been living in the deep wood like an animal, and from the looks on your faces, some of you knew about it. So start talking." Henderson, who spoke first. She was 83 years old, had lived in Millbrook her entire life, and was known for speaking her mind even when nobody wanted to hear it. She stepped forward from the crowd, leaning heavily on her cane, her face creased with lines that suddenly looked deeper than they had moments before. "Sarah Whitmore," she said, her voice cracking. "That's who you found. Sarah Whitmore. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in this town for 17 years. Thomas felt his stomach drop. 17 years. Sarah had been in those woods for 17 years. What happened to her? He demanded. Who is she? Henderson looked around at the crowd, at faces that had turned away or down toward the ground, unable to meet her eyes. Cowards, she muttered. All of you! Too ashamed to speak the truth even now. She turned back to Thomas. Sarah was born here in Millbrook 34 years ago. She was the daughter of Robert and Catherine Whitmore, good people who ran the old lumber mill on the south side of town. Sarah was their only child, and they loved her more than anything in this world. But Sarah was born different, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice heavy with old grief. She had that mark on her face, that birthmark, and she was slow, what folks today might call developmentally disabled, though back then people used crueler words. She could talk and understand things, but she was simple, childlike even as she grew older. Her parents took care of her, protected her, loved her just the same as any parent would. Thomas listened, pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. What happened 17 years ago? It was Mayor Coleman who answered, his face ashen. There was an accident at the lumber mill. A fire. Robert and Catherine both died in the flames. Sarah was 17 years old, and suddenly she had no one to take care of her. The town held a meeting, Sheriff Davies added, unable to look Thomas in the eye. We had to decide what to do with her. There was talk of sending her to a state institution, but those places, they were bad back then. Really bad. So we decided she would stay in Millbrook. Different families would take turns looking after her. And did they? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer from the way no one would meet his gaze. At first, Mrs. Henderson said bitterly. For the first few months, people tried. But Sarah was difficult sometimes. She would have episodes, fits where she would scream and break things. She didn't understand social rules, would say inappropriate things, wander off, and that mark on her face. Some of the children were frightened of it. Parents started complaining. Said she was disturbing their families, scaring their kids. So we moved her around, Mayor Coleman said quietly, family to family. But each time, it got worse. People didn't want her. Some were cruel about it, some just indifferent. And Sarah, she could sense she wasn't wanted. It made her more unstable, more frightened. Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. So what did you do? What did this town decide to do with a scared, disabled girl who had just lost her parents? The silence was damning. It was Betty Franklin who finally spoke up, the woman who owned the diner, tears streaming down her face. It was my husband's idea, she said, her voice choked. God forgive me, I went along with it. We all did. We told ourselves we were doing the right thing. He'd built her a cabin, Mayor Coleman said, out in the deep wood, far enough from town that she wouldn't disturb anyone. We told ourselves we were taking care of her. We brought her supplies once a month. Food, blankets, firewood. We said she would be happier there, away from people who didn't understand her. You imprisoned her, Thomas said, his voice shaking with rage. You took a disabled girl and locked her in the woods like an animal. It wasn't like that, Sheriff Davies protested weakly. We thought we were helping her. We thought... You thought it was easier than actually taking care of her, Thomas interrupted. You thought if she was out of sight, she would be out of mind. Tell me, when did the supplies stop? When did you people stop pretending to care? No one answered. The shame on their faces was answer enough. Thomas looked around at the crowd, seeing his neighbors, his community, with new eyes. How long? He demanded. How long since anyone checked on her? 10 years, Mrs. Did, Henderson said, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe 12. The cabin burned down, and when people went to check on her, she was gone. We found scraps of her clothes in the ruins, blood. We assumed she had died in the fire. We told ourselves she was at peace. We told ourselves it was a mercy. Thomas felt sick. You didn't look for her. You didn't search the woods, didn't try to find her body. You just assumed she was dead because it was easier than facing what you had done to her. We did look, Sheriff Davies insisted, for a few days. But the woods are vast, Thomas, you know that. And we found evidence that suggested she had died. We wanted to believe it. We needed to believe it. Because the alternative, Thomas said coldly, was admitting that you had left a helpless woman to fend for herself in the wilderness, that you had abandoned her to die slowly instead of quickly. Tell me, did any of you lose sleep over it? Did any of you think about what she must have gone through? Every day, Betty Franklin sobbed. I think about it every single day. I see her face in my dreams, the way she looked at us when we brought her to that cabin, so trusting, so hopeful that we were going to take care of her. And we just left her there. Some of us tried to speak up, Mrs. Derrickton, Henderson said. Some of us said it was wrong, that we were supposed to be Christians, supposed to care for the vulnerable. But we were outvoted. And then later, when the guilt got too heavy, when some people started saying we should bring her back to town, others said it was too late, that she wouldn't be able to readjust. We told ourselves so many lies, Thomas. We told ourselves whatever we needed to in order to keep living with what we had done. Thomas looked at them all, these people he had lived among his entire life, and felt a profound sense of betrayal. And the stories about the monster in the woods? The creature that parents warned their children about? That was Sarah, Mayor Coleman admitted. After the cabin burned, there were sightings. People would see her at night, moving through the trees, scavenging for food. She had become wild by then, feral. She would make sounds, cries that didn't sound quite human anymore. Instead of helping her, instead of bringing her home, we used her to scare our children. We turned her into a monster story. The weight of it was staggering. For 17 years, Sarah Whitmore had lived in those woods, surviving on scraps and instinct, slowly losing her humanity because the town had decided she was too inconvenient to care for. And when she had become the very monster they claimed she was, they had used her suffering as a cautionary tale. "She's at my cabin right now," Thomas said, his voice cold and hard. "She weighs maybe 90 pounds. She's covered in scars and burns and injuries that healed wrong because she had no one to help her. She can barely speak. She wrapped herself in burlap sacks because she had no clothes. And when she saw herself in the mirror, she called herself a monster because that's what you taught her to believe she was." The crowd had grown silent, the weight of their collective guilt settling over the square like a shroud. Some people were crying. Others looked angry, defensive, but most just looked stricken, confronted with a truth they had spent 17 years trying to bury. "What are you going to do?" Sheriff Davies asked quietly. "I'm going to take care of her," Thomas said. "I'm going to get her medical attention, feed her, clothe her, and give her a safe place to stay. I'm going to treat her like the human being she is, which is more than any of you did. Thomas, you don't understand." Mayor Coleman started. "Sarah is unstable. She could be dangerous." "After all those years alone, dangerous?" Thomas's laugh was bitter. "She's terrified. She flinches at every sound. She begged me not to hurt her, not to send her back." "She's not dangerous, Mayor. She's traumatized. There's a difference, but I wouldn't expect any of you to understand that." He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at the crowd. "And if anyone tries to take her from my cabin, if anyone tries to send her away or lock her up again, you'll have to go through me first. She's been alone long enough. She deserves better than this town has ever given her." Thomas walked back to his cabin, his mind reeling from what he had learned. Behind him, the crowd slowly dispersed, people returning to their homes with heavy hearts and heavier consciences. But the damage was done. The secret that Millbrook had kept for 17 years was out, and there was no putting it back. When Thomas got home, he found Sarah exactly where he had left her, curled up on the couch under a pile of blankets, staring into the dying fire. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wide and fearful. "Did you tell them?" she asked. "Do they know where I am?" Thomas sat down beside her, keeping his movements slow and gentle. "They know."
"But Sarah, they're not going to hurt you. I won't let them."
Sarah shook her head violently. "You don't understand. They said I had to stay away. They said if I came back to town, bad things would happen. They said I was cursed, that people who got too close to me would get sick or die. They said it was my fault my parents died, that my face was a mark of evil." Thomas felt rage building in his chest again, but he forced it down. Sarah needed calm, not anger. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "None of that is true. Your face is just a birthmark. It's not evil, it's not a curse, it's just how you were born. And your parents died in an accident. It had nothing to do with you. But the town," Sarah whispered. Everyone agreed. They all said, "They were wrong," Thomas said firmly. "All of them. They were cruel and they were wrong, and what they did to you was unforgivable. But I'm not going to let them hurt you anymore." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question caught Thomas off guard. Why did he care? He had lived his whole life keeping to himself, avoiding entanglements, staying on the edges of the community. He had no family, few friends, no particular reputation for compassion or charity. But looking at Sarah, at this woman who had survived 17 years of hell through sheer determination, he realized the answer was simple. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "'Cause you're a person, and you deserve to be treated like one. Because I'm ashamed that I lived in this town my whole life and never questioned the stories we told about the monster in the woods. I should have looked harder. I should have known something was wrong." Tears began to stream down Sarah's face, cutting clean tracks through the remaining grime on her cheeks. I thought everyone had forgotten about me, she said. I thought I would die out there and nobody would ever know. I know now, Thomas said gently, and I'm not going to forget. We're going to get you help, real help, medical care, therapy, whatever you need to heal from what happened to you. Over the next few hours, Thomas made good on his promise. He called Doc Harrison, the town physician, and explained the situation. The doctor arrived within 30 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his face set in grim lines. He examined Sarah carefully, documenting injuries and malnutrition and years of neglect. His diagnosis was severe but not surprising. Chronic malnutrition, multiple untreated injuries, psychological trauma, and a list of other conditions that came from living outdoors without proper shelter or care. She needs to be in a hospital, Doc Harrison said quietly to Thomas while Sarah dozed on the couch. She needs specialists, maybe even long-term psychiatric care. This is beyond what I can treat here. Then we'll get her to a hospital, Thomas said. Whatever she needs, we'll make it happen. But word of Sarah's return had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening, Thomas's cabin was surrounded by townspeople. Some came out of guilt, bringing food and supplies and apologies that rang hollow after 17 years. Others came out of morbid curiosity, wanting to see the monster made flesh. And a few came with anger, insisting that Sarah was dangerous, that she should be locked up in an institution where she couldn't harm anyone. Thomas stood on his porch and faced them all down. She's not a spectacle, he said. She's not your monster or your guilty conscience made manifest. She's a woman who survived something that would have killed most people. And she deserves privacy and respect. So, unless you're here to help, I suggest you go home. Most people did leave, slinking away into the darkness with shame written on their faces. But a few stayed. Mrs. Henderson, who brought fresh bread and offered to help with Sarah's care. Betty Franklin, who couldn't stop crying as she apologized over and over. And surprisingly, Sheriff Davies, who stood off to the side looking older than his years. I've called the state hospital, the sheriff said quietly. They can take her tomorrow. Get her the care she needs. I'll drive her there myself. No, Thomas said flatly. She's not going to any institution. You can't take care of her yourself. You don't have the training, the resources. I'll learn, Thomas interrupted. I'll get whatever help she needs, but I'm not sending her away again. She's been abandoned enough. Someone in this town needs to take responsibility for her, and it might as well be me. Sheriff Davies looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Thomas's expression stopped him. Instead, he just nodded slowly. All right. But if you need anything at all, you let me know. The town owes her that much at least. That night, after everyone had finally left, Thomas sat by the fire with Sarah. She was awake again, sipping broth from a mug and watching the flames with an expression that was hard to read. What's going to happen to me? She asked finally. Thomas chose his words carefully. That depends on what you want. You can stay here with me for as long as you need to. We'll get you healthy again, get you proper medical care, and when you're ready, we can figure out what comes next. What if I'm never ready? Sarah asked quietly. What if I can't be normal again? Then you don't have to be, Thomas said. You just have to be yourself, whatever that looks like. There's no timeline, no expectations. You've spent 10 years surviving. Now, you can start living. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since he had found her in the woods, Thomas saw something other than fear in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. I don't remember what living feels like, she admitted. Then we'll figure it out together, Thomas said. In the days that followed, word of what had happened in Millbrook spread beyond the town. News reporters came, wanting to interview Sarah, to tell the story of the woman who had survived 17 years in the wilderness. But Thomas turned them all away. Sarah's story was hers to tell, when and if she was ready, and he wasn't going to let her become a spectacle. Doc Harrison came by daily, monitoring Sarah's recovery, prescribing medications and supplements to help with the malnutrition. A therapist from the county seat started making weekly visits, helping Sarah process the trauma of what had happened to her. And slowly, incrementally, Sarah began to heal. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and bad days. Times when Sarah would wake up screaming from nightmares, convinced she was back in the woods. Days when she couldn't bring herself to go outside, when the world felt too big and too frightening. Moments when the weight of what had been done to her felt too heavy to carry. But there were good days too. The first time Sarah laughed at something Thomas said, a rusty sound like she had forgotten how her own laughter worked. The day she asked if she could help him cook dinner, and they stood side by side in the kitchen making something simple and warm. The afternoon she asked if she could go for a walk, and they spent an hour in the woods with Sarah pointing out birds and plants she had learned to identify during her years of solitude. The town watched it all with a mixture of guilt and fascination. Some people tried to make amends, showing up with gifts or offers of help. Others stayed away, unable to face what they had done. And a few whispered that Thomas was making a mistake, that Sarah would never be right, that some damage couldn't be undone. But Thomas didn't care what they thought. For the first time in years since Margaret had died and left him alone in his quiet cabin, he had a purpose. He had someone who needed him, someone he could help. And Sarah, despite everything that had been done to her, was proving stronger and more resilient than anyone had given her credit for. 3 weeks after Thomas had found her in the woods, Sarah asked him a question that had been building for days. They were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon sun, Sarah wrapped in a quilt and Thomas whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "Why didn't anyone come looking for me?" she asked. "After the cabin burned, why didn't anyone try to find me?" Thomas set down his knife. He had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. "They thought you had died in the fire," he said carefully. "They wanted to believe it because it was easier than admitting they had failed you." "Did you know about me?" Sarah asked. "Before you found me, did you know I existed?" Thomas had to be honest. "No. I knew the stories about something in the woods, but I thought they were just stories. If I had known the truth, if I had known there was a real person out there." He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Would you have looked for me?" Sarah pressed. Thomas met her eyes. "Yes, I would have. And I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry I lived in that town for 43 years and never questioned the stories they told, never pushed to know the truth. I failed you just as much as everyone else did." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then, unexpectedly, she reached over and took his hand. Her grip was still weak, her fingers thin and fragile, but the gesture was deliberate. "You found me eventually," she said softly. "That's what matters." As winter settled over Millbrook with its full force, the town found itself changed in ways that went deeper than the snow that blanketed the streets and rooftops. The secret they had kept for 17 years, the collective sin they had buried beneath layers of justification and willful ignorance, now sat exposed in the cold light of day. And like any wound that had festered too long, the revelation brought pain before it could bring healing. Thomas's cabin became a kind of refuge, not just for Sarah, but for the town's conscience. People would stop by, ostensibly to drop off supplies or check on Sarah's recovery, but really to unburden themselves of guilt that had been growing heavier with each passing year. Betty Franklin came almost daily, bringing food and sitting with Sarah, teaching her to cook simple meals, and talking to her like the human being she was. Mrs. Henderson would arrive with books and magazines, reading to Sarah for hours, her old voice cracking as she described pictures and told stories about the town as it used to be, before fear and convenience had twisted it into something darker. Even Sheriff Davies found himself drawn to the cabin, though he rarely went inside. He would stand on the porch talking to Thomas about practical matters, the weight of his badge sitting heavier on his chest than it ever had before. One evening, as snow fell in thick curtains around them, he finally admitted what everyone already knew. "I could have done more," he said, staring out at the white-covered forest. "When they first suggested putting her out there, I could have said no. I was the law. I could have insisted we find another way. But I told myself it was for the best, that she would be happier away from people who didn't understand her. The truth is, I just didn't want to deal with the complication of it." Thomas didn't offer absolution. He couldn't. But he also understood that confession, even late, was a necessary part of healing. "What are you going to do now?" he asked instead. Davies was quiet for a long moment. "I've been looking into what happened, officially, documenting everything. What the town did to Sarah, it was criminal. Neglect, abandonment, probably a dozen other charges. I'm putting it all in a report, sending it to the state. People need to be held accountable." "Including yourself?" Thomas asked. Davies nodded slowly. "Especially myself. I'm resigning as sheriff. I don't deserve to wear this badge, not after what I allowed to happen. But before I go, I'm going to make sure there's a record of what we did, so it can never happen again." So Sarah's story is told, officially, in a way that can't be ignored or forgotten. Inside the cabin, Sarah was learning to live again in ways both large and small. The physical recovery came first. Under Doc Harrison's care and with regular meals, she began to gain weight. The hollow look left her face, replaced by fuller cheeks and eyes that didn't sink quite so deep into their sockets. Her hair, once a matted tangle of filth and debris, was cut short and clean, revealing dark brown waves that framed her face. The scars on her body would never fully fade, but they became less angry, less raw, settling into silver lines that mapped the story of her survival. But the psychological recovery was harder, more complex. There were nights when Sarah would wake up screaming, convinced she was back in the woods, cold and alone and hunted by sounds in the darkness. She would have panic attacks in enclosed spaces, the cabin sometimes feeling too much like the prison it had become in those last months before the fire. And there were days when she would shut down completely, retreating into a silence so deep that Thomas worried she might never come out of it. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, who drove up from the county seat twice a week, worked patiently with Sarah on processing the trauma. She explained to Thomas that what Sarah had endured was beyond anything most people could imagine. 17 years of isolation, of being told she was a monster, of having to survive in the wilderness with limited mental capacity to understand why it was happening to her. The miracle, Dr. Marsh said one afternoon, is that she survived it all. Most people would have died, either from exposure or from simply giving up. Sarah didn't give up. That tells me she's stronger than anyone ever gave her credit for. And Sarah was strong. As the weeks turned into months, she began to reclaim pieces of herself that had been lost in the woods. She remembered things from before the fire, from her childhood with her parents. She would tell Thomas stories about her father teaching her to identify trees, about her mother singing while she cooked dinner, about the small moments of joy that had existed before everything fell apart. "I wasn't always like this," she told Thomas one evening. They were sitting by the fire, Sarah with a cup of tea warming her hands. I was always slow, always different, but I could read a little. I knew my numbers. I helped Mama in the kitchen and Papa in the workshop. I had a life." "You'll have a life again," Thomas promised. But Sarah shook her head. "Not the same life. That Sarah died in the fire. I can't get her back." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "But maybe I can be a different Sarah." Maybe that's enough? It was around this time that Sarah asked if she could go into town. It was a simple request, but it carried enormous weight. Since Thomas had brought her back, she hadn't set foot on Main Street, hadn't seen any of the buildings or people beyond those who came to visit her. The town existed in her mind as it had 17 years ago, and she was both curious and terrified to see what had changed. Thomas was reluctant. He worried about how people would react, whether they would stare or whisper or say things that would hurt Sarah. But Dr. Marsh encouraged her. "She can't hide forever," the therapist said. "Part of reclaiming her humanity is reclaiming her place in the world. She needs to see that she's not a monster, that she can exist in public spaces like anyone else." So on a cold January morning, Thomas and Sarah walked into Millbrook together. Sarah was dressed in warm clothes that actually fit, her hair neatly brushed, her face clean. The birthmark on her cheek was visible, had always been visible, but it was just a mark now, not the defining feature it had once been made out to be. The effect on the town was immediate and profound. People stopped what they were doing to stare, but not with the morbid curiosity Thomas had feared. Instead, their faces showed shame and regret. Some people turned away, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Others approached hesitantly, offering awkward apologies and words of welcome that came 17 years too late. Sarah handled it with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She nodded at the apologies, accepted the welcomes, and kept walking with her head held high. When a small child, too young to know the history, pointed at her birthmark and asked loudly what it was, Sarah knelt down to the child's level. "It's just a mark I was born with," she said gently. "Like a freckle, but bigger. It doesn't hurt." The child's mother looked mortified, but Sarah just smiled. It was a small moment, but Thomas saw in it something important. Sarah was teaching the town, showing them by example how to treat someone who was different, not with fear or cruelty, but with simple human kindness. They went to Betty's diner, where Betty herself burst into tears at the sight of Sarah sitting in a booth like a normal customer. She brought them coffee and pancakes and refused to let them pay, sitting with them when the morning rush died down and talking to Sarah about everything and nothing. Other customers came and went, some stopping by the table to say hello, others keeping their distance but watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to deep shame. By the time they left, something had shifted in Millbrook. The town had seen Sarah not as a monster or a ghost or a symbol of their collective guilt, but as a person. A woman who had survived impossible circumstances and was now trying to rebuild a life that had been stolen from her. But not everyone was ready to face the truth. There were people in Millbrook who believed that bringing Sarah back was a mistake, that the past should stay buried. They whispered in the shadows about how Thomas was making everything worse, how Sarah should be in an institution where she could be properly cared for, how her presence in town was a constant reminder of sins they wanted to forget. These whispers came to a head at a town hall meeting in February. Mayor Coleman had called the meeting to discuss what should be done about Sarah, what responsibility the town had to her now that she had returned. The community center was packed, standing room only, with tensions running high from the moment the first gavel fell. Thomas sat in the front row with Sarah beside him. She had insisted on coming, despite his protests. "They're talking about me," she had said. "I should be there. I should have a say." The debate was fierce, and at times ugly. Some people argued that the town should support Sarah, provide her with financial assistance and medical care as recompense for what had been done to her. Others insisted that putting her in the deep wood had been the right decision at the time, that they had done the best they could with limited options, and that they owed her nothing beyond basic charity. Thomas listened to the arguments with growing anger. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. But it was Sarah who finally stood up, who walked to the front of the room with her head high despite the trembling in her hands. "I want to say something," she announced, her voice quiet but clear. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her, this woman they had tried to erase standing before them in the flesh. Sarah took a deep breath. "I know what you all think of me. Monster, burden, problem. I heard those words my whole life, even before you sent me away. And for a long time, I believed them. I believed I was cursed, that my face was a sign of evil, that people got hurt because of me." She touched the birthmark on her cheek, that purple stain that had defined so much of her existence. "It's just a mark. It's just skin. It doesn't make me evil or cursed or less than human. You made me believe those things because it was easier than accepting me for who I was." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "You sent me to live in the woods because I made you uncomfortable. 'Cause taking care of me was hard, and you didn't want to do it. And when the cabin burned and you thought I was dead, you were relieved. You could finally stop feeling guilty about abandoning me." The accusations hung in the air, undeniable and true. People shifted in their seats, unable to meet her eyes. "But I didn't die," Sarah continued. "I survived. For 17 years, I lived in those woods like an animal because I didn't know any other way. I was scared and cold and hungry and alone, and I thought that was all I deserved because that's what you taught me to believe about myself." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. "Thomas found me. He could have left me there, could have pretended he never saw me, but he didn't. He brought me home and took care of me, and treated me like a person for the first time in 17 years. He showed me that I'm not a monster, that I deserve kindness and respect and a place in this world." Sarah's voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "I don't know what I want from you. I don't know if I can forgive what you did to me. But I do know that I'm not going away again. This is my town too. I was born here, my parents are buried here, and I have just as much right to be here as anyone else. So you're going to have to get used to seeing me. You're going to have to get used to remembering what you did." She turned and walked back to her seat, her legs shaking but her head still held high. The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over them like a physical thing. It was Mrs. Henderson who started the applause. Slow at first, just her gnarled old hands coming together in a steady rhythm. But then others joined in, one by one, until the entire room was applauding. Some people were crying. Others looked angry or ashamed, but they were clapping, acknowledging Sarah's right to speak, her right to exist, her right to demand better from the town that had failed her. The vote that followed was unanimous. Millbrook would provide Sarah with financial support for as long as she needed it. They would cover her medical expenses, her therapy, whatever she required to build a life. It wasn't justice. Not really. No amount of money could give back the 17 years she had lost. but it was acknowledgement. It was the town taking responsibility, however belatedly, for what they had done. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah continued to heal and grow. She started helping out at Betty's diner a few hours a week, simple tasks like refilling coffee and clearing tables, but it gave her a sense of purpose and a connection to the community. She took classes at the community center, learning to read better and work with numbers, skills that had atrophied during her years of isolation, and she began to talk about her parents more, asking Thomas to take her to their graves. He did, on a warm April morning when the first flowers were beginning to push through the earth. Sarah stood before the headstones, weathered and moss-covered, and told her parents about everything that had happened, everything she had endured. She apologized for surviving when they hadn't, for being the burden they had always tried to shield her from becoming. Thomas, standing a respectful distance away, felt tears on his own face. He thought about Margaret, about the children they had never had, about the life he had lived in quiet isolation. Finding Sarah had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. She had given him purpose, yes, but more than that, she had reminded him of what it meant to be human, to care for someone, to fight for someone, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. Over time, the relationship between Thomas and Sarah evolved into something neither of them had expected. It wasn't romantic, wasn't paternal or fraternal. It was something else entirely, a bond forged in shared experience and mutual respect. They were family, chosen rather than born, built on the foundation of survival and second chances. Sarah never fully recovered from what had been done to her. The trauma was too deep, the scars too permanent. She still had nightmares, still struggled with anxiety in crowds and the weight of her memories, but she learned to live with it, to carry her pain without letting it define her completely. The town of Millbrook changed too, though the transformation was slow and incomplete. Some people genuinely tried to make amends, reaching out to Sarah with sincere apologies and offers of friendship. Others could never quite meet her eyes, the guilt too heavy to face directly. And a few left town entirely, unable to live with what they had done and unwilling to do the work of making it right. Sheriff Davies kept his word. He resigned his position and submitted a full report to the state authorities documenting what had happened to Sarah Whitmore. An investigation was launched, interviews conducted, testimonies taken. In the end, no criminal charges were filed. Too much time had passed, and the legal complexities of collective responsibility made prosecution nearly impossible. But the story made news. First locally, then regionally, then nationally. Millbrook became known as the town that had hidden a woman in the woods, that had called her a monster and left her to die. The attention was uncomfortable, unwanted. News crews descended on the town, wanting interviews, wanting to film Sarah, to turn her tragedy into a story with a neat beginning, middle, and end. But Sarah refused. Her story was her own, and she would tell it on her own terms or not at all. 2 years after Thomas found her in the woods, Sarah stood on the porch of what was now legally her cabin, as well as his. They had made it official, the town transferring ownership to both of them as part of their restitution. She looked out at the forest where she had spent so many years, and instead of fear, she felt something close to peace. The deep wood would always be part of her story, those 17 years woven into who she was in ways that could never be undone. But they didn't own her anymore. She had reclaimed her name, her humanity, her place in the world. She was Sarah Whitmore. Not a monster, not a burden, not a cautionary tale. Just a woman who had survived the unsurvivable and learned to live again. Thomas joined her on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed one to her and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains. They didn't need to speak. After everything they had been through together, words often felt unnecessary. But Sarah did speak, her voice soft but certain. "Thank you," she said, "for finding me, for not leaving me out there, for giving me back my life." Thomas shook his head. "You gave yourself back your life. I just helped you remember it was there." In town, Millbrook was waking up to another day. Stores were opening, people were beginning their morning routines, children were heading to school. On the surface, everything looked normal, peaceful, like any other small town in America. But beneath that surface, there was a change, subtle but permanent. Awareness of their capacity for cruelty, yes, but also their capacity for redemption. The story of what happened in Millbrook spread far beyond the valley where it sat. It became a cautionary tale, but not the kind the town had used to frighten children. Instead, it became a warning about what happens when communities choose convenience over compassion. When they look away from suffering because acknowledging it would be difficult. It became a reminder that monsters are made, not born, and that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed by ordinary people who convince themselves they're doing the right thing. But it also became a story of resilience, of survival against impossible odds. Sarah's story inspired others who had been marginalized, abandoned, told they were less than human. She became a symbol, though she never sought that role, of the strength it takes to reclaim your humanity after the world has tried to strip it away. Years passed. Sarah continued to heal, to grow, to build a life that was uniquely hers. She never forgot what had been done to her. That would have been impossible. But she learned to carry it differently, as a part of her history rather than the sum total of her identity. She made friends, found joy in small moments, discovered interests and hobbies she had never had the chance to explore before. Thomas grew old alongside her, his hair going white, his movements becoming slower and more careful. But he never regretted the day he found Sarah in the woods, never wished he had turned around and left her there. Taking care of her had given his life meaning in a way nothing else ever had. And Millbrook learned to live with its history, the way all communities must learn to live with their sins. They put up a memorial in the town square, a simple stone marker that read, "In memory of the years Sarah Whitmore was lost to us. May we never forget. May we never repeat." It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a promise to do better. On quiet mornings when the mist rolled through the valley and the world felt suspended between darkness and light, Sarah would sometimes walk to the edge of the deep wood. She would stand at the tree line, looking into the forest that had been both her prison and her salvation, and remember the cold and the hunger and the fear. Remember the animal she had been forced to become. Remember the day Thomas Creek had found her and everything had changed. But mostly, she would remember that she had survived, that she was still here, still standing, still human despite everything that had tried to convince her otherwise. And in those moments, standing between the town that had failed her and the wilderness that had tested her, Sarah Whitmore would smile, because she had won. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, her place in the world. The monster they had created in the woods was gone. In its place stood a woman who had learned that survival is not the same as living, but that sometimes survival is what allows you to eventually find your way back to life. A woman who had been called a monster and covered in burlap, who had been discovered by a hunter and brought back into the light. A woman whose story had silenced a town not with horror, but with shame. And then, slowly, had taught them how to speak again, with honesty, with humility, with a commitment to never look away from suffering just because it's easier than helping. Sarah's story didn't have a neat ending, because real stories never do. She continued to live, continued to heal, continued to exist in a world that had tried very hard to erase her. And every day that she woke up in a warm bed, ate a hot meal, saw her reflection in a mirror and recognized herself as human, every one of those days was an act of defiance, a victory over the people who had decided she was too inconvenient to care for. The town of Millbrook would carry the weight of what they had done forever, but they would also carry the lesson Sarah had taught them, that redemption is possible, but only if you're willing to face the truth, no matter how ugly it is. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong and commit to being better. That everyone deserves dignity, compassion, and a place to belong. And they would remember Sarah Whitmore not as a monster in the woods or a cautionary tale, but as a survivor, a fighter, and a reminder of both the worst and best that humanity is capable of becoming.